Hey, Game. Craig and I are super excited for this opportunity to be here today. We've got a presentation about building blocks that we've put together. We hope you find valuable. There's many different ways you could do building blocks. For us, this is kind of the beginning stage in creating the assets for a champion, and we'll dive deeper into what that means. Also, many different ways that you can do this. So Craig's got his method that he's going to use and show us, which is really awesome. And I will also show you my methods. Before we jump into that, a little bit about ourselves. Again, my name is Brandon Reeder. I've been at Riot Games for 6 years now. I started on the video team as an audio mixer, working on champion spotlights. And after that, moved to the skins team, worked on a number of skins like Project Master Yi, Program Lysandra, Darkstar Varus, and many more. After a year there, moved over to the gameplay audio team where I worked on champions like Kayn, Kai'Sa, Kayle, Nunu, and many more. Craig, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Brandon. My name is Craig Deskins. I'm the audio lead on the personalization team for League of Legends. I've been at Riot Games for around 4 years now. Spend most of my time on the personalization team. I did do a short stint on the champion team, though, as well. I worked on the Mordekaiser update recently, the Pantheon update. Some of the more well-known skins I've worked on are Nightbringer Yasuo, Psyop Sona skin, as well as dozens of other skins I've worked on a lot. We're going to split this presentation out into two different sections. The first section is Brandon's going to cover some from-scratch sound design, how he finds the source for certain magics, certain impacts, whooshes, that sort of thing. And in the second half of this presentation, I'll be showing how you can take some of that original magic source as well as other materials and blend them and mangle them into other usable assets that you can use while sound designing. So Brandon's going to take it from here. He's going to start you off. Without further ado, take it away, Brandon.
Cool. Thanks, Craig. So basically, building blocks, where do we start? Where do we get the inspiration? How does it all happen? I'm going to explain that here. You may have heard in Mateo's earlier talk a little bit about building blocks, and that's what we're going to dive into, with the first thing being audio one sheets. What is an audio one sheet? Basically, this is where all these ideas come together, things that inspire us. Champion briefs. This is where narrative gets together and starts to create the pillars of this champion and gives us kind of like a summary of who they are, the background, some of the lore, and we're going to find where their attitudes are and what drives them. If you look down here, we've got Clash of Egos, we got Fury versus Control, Permanent Transformation. These are all pillars for Kayn when we were working on him. So these things here help you look at what type of sound you should start looking for. It's not going to tell you what to record, but it's going to at least give you some type of inspiration or idea of what you may have seen in maybe movies or cartoons or video games, something that you can find inspiration on. And that's what this palette shows here. I've got many different pieces of inspiration that have led me to want to record things like smoke, things like blades and really rough edges, putting voices in the smoke. And the sound palette over here is going to kind of be where you mark these ideas down. None of this is actually recorded on right away. It's more so, what is it that you're going to use? What kind of ideas do you want to think of? And some may not work, and some will probably work and do really well and work with other champions. So that's what this is here. I also like to put in here things to avoid. When working on these textures, I really want to try to avoid void sounding stuff, because that would bring it into a different thematic and not fit very well for this character. Blunt impacts or white noise, something that's going to make him not feel so much like the kind of character that you want to shape. And so for Kayn, I recorded many different things. And one of the things that we try to do for all of our champions is we look for that iconic texture, that iconic feel. And sometimes we always call that like, what is this champion's magic? And magic doesn't always necessarily mean like this sparkly texture that you hear. That is magic, but we always look for that iconic feel that each champion has, what they can bring to the Summoner's Rift. When you have 5 versus 5, you have a lot of sound happening at once. What does each one bring to the table that makes them iconic and resonate on that field? So for Kane, that texture that I found when he turns into Rost was from a synth called the JP8000. And I think I processed that sound with a bunch of blocks from Native Instruments, which a patch that I made from that, and created this weird bird-like sound that for me kind of fit the shape language of his blade, and it felt very dark. And since he is this darken, which is kind of like a demon, it was something that texturally really made sense to me. And so you'll hear this on his W. And I'll play a couple of pieces that you can hear from this recording. And so these were recordings used for him to help kind of shape what that texture is for his magic. Let's go to the next one here. Kiana. So she's got this round blade. She's got really interesting movement. She's very agile, and she doesn't wield magic, but her blade does have magic in it. It can pull magic from the earth. And so this was a really difficult one to kind of design for. So I spent a lot of time researching what a lot of her movement was here. So you can see I put some pictures of her movement, the coloring and shape language of these elements in her blade. Her pillars are Regal Swagger, Cutthroat Princess, and Elemental Ring Blade Master. And so I tried to pick the most interesting texture, and I wanted to play with water. So with this one, I found that taking a brass bowl and submerging it into a tub of water with the hydrophone in the water, if you submerge it slowly, the water will rush in and then it collapses on each other. So I would record that sound live and process it live as well, and would come up with some really interesting texture that you won't hear when you hear the asset, when you hear the building blocks. When you listen to them, it's more like pieces that get used and then layered on. And when you hear this in game, it'll actually start to make sense, and that texture will actually stand out a little bit more. So I'm gonna play some of that here. So with this texture, it was something that moved with the way she would put this into her blade. She would suck the water out as an element and push it into her blade, and layered with other things, it was very impactful sound, and it felt very fluid and felt right in this aesthetic. Let's look at this last one here, Nunu. Nunu was a really fun one. This was all about being playful and playing pretend and being with your best bud. So this one for me was like, okay, how do I find playful and pretend and all this and icy? This is using true ice and trying to find this cold texture while being playful. That was a big challenge for me. And so I'm actually going to dive deep into that challenge and how this all came about. But just looking at the pillars here, we have Frost Behemoth, obviously for Willump, Unlikely Brothers on an Adventure, and Playful Fantastical Snow Magic. The things that are important here is that I really execute on the playful aspect. And so I'm going to dive into that with these building blocks. Now, before I go into that, just a quick little recap. When you're doing building blocks, I always start with like the source material. And the source material can either be field recording or it can be something synthesized. And usually finding what that source is. Usually when I'm doing something with the synthesizing, which is what I'm going to show at in this demo, is I try to find a really interesting source and just record a bunch of that. Later, it goes into the processing portion, and then we will process and make it sound a little more interesting. And then last, we'll put it into what is the shaping of those envelopes. And that's going to be the second part of my portion here. This is the first portion, which is the source. I'm going to be using a synth. A little bit about this synth here. This is Prism. I really love Prism. Prism's a really great synth. A lot of cool things you can make, a lot of neat patches. There's, you know, the sense that like I'm actually in this one, I'm going to be showing a patch that was a preset given when you purchase this. We make a lot of patches using a patch or a preset that's already there. It really doesn't matter. In my perspective, does it sound good? In this case, we're just going to use a preset because I want to be able to show kind of like the quickest way to get to that magic. That's what this demo is going to be about. So I'm going to use some presets in Prism. So what I like to do is I like to take and record 3 synths at the same time. I usually load up a synth and Glass World. This is for new, something that I found and played through a lot of these. I really liked Glass World. It had some really interesting texture to it. So we're going to play that first. Cool. So this sound here is like the one sound that I thought was really nice and cold sounding. It was very high interesty. There was like the brightness felt to me like very icy in a sense, like it could sound like ice magic. And the low end that you heard there, I thought was a really nice touch for the cold feeling. So this is just one layer. I don't think I would just record one preset and try to make content out of this. I always find that like adding more synths to it actually fills it in. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna look at the next synth here. And here I'm using a preset called 80s Horror, and we'll listen to this one. So this synth here, this preset, to me was also cold, also slightly icy, but I felt like there was a little bit more like cutesiness to it. I think it's more playful and fun, and I think it actually might support the other one, or vice versa. I think they might do really well together. And so the last synth here we're looking at is Massive, and I'm using a preset called Question of Time. And let's see what this one does for us. Cool. So not so much high interest, but it definitely has a lot of depth and weight to it. I love that like low hum kind of felt like something that was building. There was a slow attack to it. I think that might actually be really nice with all the icy bits and pieces here that we can layer in later. So as a full magic, as one sound with these 3 synths, we might have a really cool piece come together. So let's listen to all 3 of those. Cool. So I'm super happy with that result. It was super easy, very quick, and something that I can just start recording now. So typically what I'll do is I'll record about maybe 30 files, maybe 40, depending, to give me a lot of variation. I usually play with the pitch or the octave. I usually go up and down a couple and try to grab whatever I can. I might find really interesting moments, and I might find things that may be a mistake that could result into something cool later. So I'll record a bunch of that for the next portion, which is the processing. So I'm going to make these inactive and pull up the next set. One more synth. Sometimes when you're using or making building blocks, I like to try to encapsulate and do a big batch of magic to kind of fit that champion that we're working on or that character. So not all the time is it going to fit. Sometimes there's very unique situations. And in this case, I'm going to show you a patch that I made here in Absinthe. I love Absinthe a whole lot, but you may need something very specific, very unique. And here, this is a very specific case. So this is just one synth, Absinthe, and for this patch, I'm using, there's 3 oscillators. If you don't know Absinthe 5, it's a great synth. You can do a lot of cool stuff. It's got a lot of cool effects as well. But I'm going to use all 3 oscillators. And all 3 oscillators here have a lot of different parameters. I'm setting it here, double. There's FM, there's ring mod. I want to set it to double. And what you can do is add modifiers too, literally clicking in place and trying to find which one might work best for you. And there's a lot of parameters as well. But what's cool about them is they have these things called morphing waves. And these waves are actually set so that you can modulate them to add more depth, movement, and character to your sound. So in here, I'm using one called Curvy Pipes. And it's actually set to my mod wheel so that when I turn my mod wheel, you will see this kind of movement happening as you play the sound. And that's what makes it really interesting. There's more effects going on here, and using Aetherizer, which is a really cool effect that Absinthe has. But the goal here is that I'm looking for a really interesting icy sound. And I want the ice sound to be almost like the kind of sound you have when you're squeezing an ice cube in your mouth before it crunches. And that really high, piercing, squelchy, squeezy sound is the goal. So there's going to be moments where it doesn't sound quite like that, and then moments where it does. And so I'll just record a bunch of that and kind of capture what I want. So we'll play this one here so you can hear it. Let's turn these off so you can hear it a little more clear. And so you're hearing moments where it gets really digital and almost kind of like, does that even fit Nunu? And then you hear moments that are like really like resonant-y and really squeezy sounding. And that's the portion that I'm looking for. And so the next step now, we'll go back to processing. So we're going to open up Whoosh next. So the sounds that you heard from the Absinthe, those crystal sounds, I will just basically dump them into Whoosh. This little button here is going to open up where we can drop our files in. We have 4 sources. So each source is just going to take, let's say you're working on some type of elementalist and they have like maybe they wield fire. You could have here a bunch of cool whooshes. You could add into source 2 like a bunch of your fire source, and source 3 could be more whooshes, and then source 4 could be like ash and crackles or whatever you want. So you could really get really interesting and creative with the sources that you use. In this case, I'm putting the same source in all 4 of these. So I just look at the number on the very last one. This is going to give us our range. So we have 20 here. So I'm going to close this now. I'm going to go to the mixer. Now you can see here on each source, as you can see these tabs, I have everything set to range 20. All right. And what I'll do, the default, these are not clicked, so I'll show you here, but I just click randomize. This is key so that we don't land on the same range. And the default also sets everything to grain. I click it to loop, but grain is really cool. You can do different things. You can set the size, which it'll, the way it plays is it will run through those grain windows as you play it. For this scenario, we're going to use the whole window. And that's how we're going to set up the mixing portion. Now up here in the Doppler, we have a few different knobs that need to be attenuated. And that is the duration. The duration is going to be the length across this. The speed will be the speed across this axis here. The distance is going to be from the listener to the object. And so these are all, these can all be modulated. Pitch is usually set to default. I turn this off because I don't like the pitch for these scenarios. I usually turn it on if I'm doing something very specific, but for what I'm going to show you, I keep it off. I think that's it for here. So what I do is I'll record what's called trails. In my naming convention, whatever I do here will be underscore trails, which is basically coverage of the type of magic or the sound that I created. I don't know exactly what things the kit or the sound that this champion is going to need, but I can guess and I can try to get as much of one thing that I think it might need. And this is one way to do that. So the trails is going to be basically the coverage of any type of that magic. Maybe it does some really interesting things. There might be accidents. This is an area where anything goes and you just kind of record whatever happens. But what's happening is you're mixing 4 sources together, not all at once, but at different times. So we're going to hear that right now. So let's keep this at manual. You can change that by this keyboard here. We're going to set it to manual. And then what I'm going to do is just take the node and go across this axis really slowly and do different things. Every time it crosses the middle here, you'll see all the random samples change. And that's really key for us too. So here we go. And that's what I call trails. I just record an output of me moving around and just kind of going back and forth between different sources to get the coverage that I'm looking for of the magic that I recorded from the source. And so the next part that I'll show you is called buys. Very, very simple names here that I'm using. we're going to use this button here in the run mode, and we're going to kind of tweak a little bit of stuff here. So there's this parameter here called SYM. At default, it sits in the middle here. And what this is going to do is the closer to the end on the left that we go, the faster the head will start its play. So it could either be here and maybe play in this portion here. It's going to take some time to ramp up and play around here. Or if I go all the way here, it's going to start right at the middle. So for buys, I like to kind of get them kind of quick. So before it hits that middle portion, I kind of leave it a little open. I don't close it all the way. And I may address maybe the distance or the speed or the duration depending on what the sound feels like or sounds like going across. So we're just going to listen to it right now and see what this feels like. Cool. So I think I want to bring this down a little more. Some good, some bad. Basically, recording what you want and get the coverage you want in these buys and really try to shape how you want. You can have them really fast across. They could be very snappy depending on how you modulate these here. So the next one we're going to show is going to be hits. And basically taking this SYM function, going all the way down, and now we're going to have that sound start right here in the middle. And what I love about this is that normally when I'm making an explosion, a magical explosion, I usually have to layer it with other content. And what this is going to allow me to do is use as much of the magic layer as I can possible so that you hear it and that the transient is actually this raw magic. And I don't have to layer as much to make this thing an explosive feel. And so what we're going to do is keep these settings here, and we can adjust later as we listen. And here we go. And that's basically how you get those hit sounds. Very raw source and very little layering you need to do unless you want a really massive explosion. But this is what I found for me, a method to get really quick and really easy sounds and get as much coverage and with transients, with buys, and with what I call trails, which has come in very handy for me. I'd like to turn the time over to Craig. He's got some really cool stuff that he's going to show you, and I'll give that time over to Craig.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan.